Okay, so many of you will have heard and seen news stories about a scandal that's been breaking in Ottawa over the last 2 weeks, and it's kind of been complicated to understand, and there's been a lot that has happened in the last 24 hours. So I want to do two things for you today. I want to break down what the scandal is about, but more importantly, why you need to care about it. I just watched some coverage of what happened yesterday, and it was sort of this 5-second news clip of this incredibly damning testimony, and then 5 seconds of the Prime Minister saying nothing to see here, folks. So for those of you who have just that's been your only exposure to this, I just ask you to take a couple of minutes so that you understand actually what's going on and why what happened yesterday is so incredibly bad. And again, regardless of how you vote, why you need to care about it. So this story starts with a company called SNC Lavalin, and it's a Montreal-based company. It's big. There's a lot of employees at it. And it's based out of Montreal, and it does like engineering and contracting. In 2015, the RCMP laid out some charges against this company, which they're allegedly involved in bribing Libyan dictators, or the officials within the Libyan dictatorial regime of Muammar Gaddafi. And that's important because, you know, these are kind of bad guys, and the RCMP at the time said, look, there's laws preventing this, and also this just is bad governance writ large. So there were charges that were laid out against this company. Now, under the former Harper government, we put in place something called the Director of Public Prosecutions. And what that did was essentially make the Crown, or the government's, like the decision on when to lay charges and how to proceed with it, arm's length and separate from political interference, which is as it should be. Politicians shouldn't be making decisions on what goes to trial, how things are proceeded with writ large. There's a reason why we separate the judicial branch or the law enforcement branch from the executive or from Parliament, right? So the Director of Public Prosecutions has a decision on how to proceed with these types of situations. Now, fast forward, SNC Lavalin is a very well-connected company. There's a lot of money associated with it. And as these proceedings went forward, SNC Lavalin is reported to have, and I mean, it's right on the lobbyist registry, they went on this full court press. They started lobbying Justin Trudeau's government, like basically everybody, meeting after meeting after meeting. What you need to know is that the Director of Public Prosecution, so this arm's length agency, decided to take this case to trial. Now, this is not what SNC Lavalin wanted, according to news testimony as well as testimony that's been laid out here in Parliament on the last couple of days. In the last budget, the last federal budget, the budget is usually accompanied by a bill or an implementation bill. So the government lays out how much they're going to spend, and then there's legislation that's usually required to make sure that they can do that spending. Now, government spending aside, Trudeau spending aside, the last budget bill, the last budget implementation bill that he put forward was just like, it was super thick. It had all of these legislative pieces in it, and it was massive. It was called an omnibus bill because it had a lot of stuff in it. And, you know, it's one of these things that as a legislator, you know, it's kind of difficult to go through at the time. But in that huge piece of legislation, they snuck in something called a deferred prosecution agreement. Now, why is this important? Deferred prosecution agreement, simply put, is a tool in which the Director of Public Prosecutions, so this arm's length agency I was just talking to you about, this arm's length office, can decide that instead of proceeding to trial in a situation similar to SNC Lavalin, that they can essentially come up with a plan that the company sort of just pays a fine. I'm oversimplifying, but you can see why this would benefit a company like SNC Lavalin, because if SNC Lavalin was proceeded to a trial, you know, obviously there would potentially be stock implications, but also under current regulations, they couldn't bid on federal contracts should they be found guilty. So the deferred prosecution agreement would solve a lot of problems for this company. So they've been lobbying. All of a sudden, the deferred prosecution agreement made it into the budget under Justin Trudeau last year, snuck it in, right? But it's still the Director of Public Prosecution's call on whether or not to use that or to proceed to trial. Now, SNC Lavalin went on this huge lobbying spree. The Director of Public Prosecutions decided, no, we're still proceeding to trial. I want to talk about some of the reasons why I think why. We don't know, but I want to give you some context there in a second. So the Director of Prosecution said, nope, no paying a fine or whatever. This is serious. You're going to trial. Then we have the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General, Jody Wilson-Raybould. This is where the rubber hits the road on this. Now, the Director of Public Prosecutions made this decision, and what Jody Wilson-Raybould testified at the Justice Committee yesterday about, for all intents and purposes, was that there was a coordinated, consistent campaign put in place by the Prime Minister's office, and she named the Prime Minister himself, to get the Director of Public Prosecutions to change their mind and not go to a trial, but to go to this deferred prosecution agreement instead. Now, something you need to know is that when considering whether or not to go to a deferred prosecution agreement, the argument of jobs, that's not part of it, right? But what Jody Wilson-Raybould did yesterday was lay out in immaculate detail with evidence, like text messages, emails and things, and notes of conversations, to say that the government, under Justin Trudeau, she implicated the finance minister in his office, the prime minister, that he is now alleged of asking her to politically interfere in the decision to take this to a trial. And some of the reasons, and I'm paraphrasing, that she cited were there's jobs at stake in Montreal, and some things around whether or not the Liberals would be reelected. One of the lines that I don't have it correctly, like I don't have it off the top of my head in front of me, it was something to the effect of the Prime Minister was suggested to have said, I'm an MP from Papineau, which is in Quebec, or I'm the MP from Papineau, I'm from Quebec. Some of the other lines that were used was the Quebec election is approaching. We can have the best policy in the world, but we still need to get reelected. So she sort of inserted this concept of the fact that they were using political gains to potentially interfere in this decision. Now, why is this important? Why does this matter? First of all, there's one thing that makes Canada a democracy first and foremost, and that's that we have an independent judiciary. I've had the opportunity to travel around to the world to some not great places to look at struggles that other countries have. And where you have countries where the judiciary is corrupt or is not separate from political influence, those are not free democracies like Canada, right? So you have to ask the question, if you can politically interfere to get someone off the hook, what happens if you politically interfere because you want someone to be charged with something? This is why the judiciary, that decision, that process I was just talking about, needs to be separate from political influence. So what's being alleged here is that the Prime Minister was trying to take away that particular element of Canadian democracy and our system of governance. So regardless of how you vote, if you're talking to somebody about this, they need to care, because no matter what political stripe we are, in Canada, we should agree that we should not be having political interference in the judicial process or in the law enforcement process, right? That's very important. So that's why you need to care, number one, is because the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, based on the testimony of Jody Wilson-Raybould yesterday, stands accused of doing just that. And that's why, primarily, the newspapers today, you don't have to take my word for it, there are many newspapers who have put out this comment. The Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, has lost the moral authority to govern in this country, right? Because if he's implicated in doing this, what else has he done? What else would he do? you have to have the moral authority to uphold that principle of democracy, even if you don't like the situation or it might cost you. You are paid to be a public servant and put the well-being of the Canadian public first, not your own interest, okay? So that's the big daddy here. So this is why yesterday, after learning all of this stuff from Jody Wilson-Raybould, we called on the Prime Minister to resign because we believe that he has lost the moral authority to govern. And there's lots of other questions. There's somebody called the Clerk of the Privy Council. This is the guy who, if you have a small company or something like that, he would be the equivalent of the CEO, except he's a CEO for government. He's like the top bureaucrat. His name's Michael Wernick. And he appeared before our committee this week and said, oh, no, nothing happened like this. There was no undue influence. Again, I'm paraphrasing his comments, but he suggested that Jody Wilson-Raybould, there was no undue influence placed on her. And yesterday's testimony that she put forward completely blew this out of the water. So now you've got Justin Trudeau. Why should you care? Because the public service, all of the people that we employ, and many of you who are watching right now, you might be employed by the government. You're supposed to be independent and free of political influence. And now you've got the top guy in the public service of Canada, Michael Wernick, basically being accused, again in newspapers, of being impartial and being contradicted by the former Attorney General of this country. It's crazy. So now you've got this issue of the public service not being independent anymore. So again, it's that erosion of democracy issue that's being looked at here. The third thing why it's important is that you have to watch Justin Trudeau's language on this. Today, after all these allegations came out, he chose to go to Montreal to have this very brief press conference. And why did he do that? Because as Jody Wilson-Raybould laid out yesterday, this is a political issue in Quebec. SNC Lavalin has a lot of employees in the Montreal area. Now, I support jobs in all areas of the country, but the accusations that have been leveled against this company, the director of public prosecution said, look, we're not supposed to look at economic arguments here by law. We have to look at the severity of what's being leveled and make a decision on how to proceed with the prosecution. So to put it in perspective, I stood in the House of Commons yesterday. Many of you watched this video. There were reports in the Quebec media yesterday that SNC Lavalin was alleged to have, as part of this bribery scheme, paid for $30,000 worth of prostitutes for Muammar Gaddafi's son. This is not a victimless crime that they're being alleged to have committed. This is really serious. And it's beyond that. There's tens of millions of dollars of bribery charges that have been laid out. And again, none of these have been proven in court. But the reality is the severity here is pretty big. So Justin Trudeau's in Montreal laying out the argument for jobs. But you have to start asking yourself, at what cost? And also, this is a really divisive, dangerous narrative that the Prime Minister is laying out. He's saying, so Jody Wilson-Raybould went into the Justice Committee yesterday and said this. She said this, the Prime Minister put pressure on me, and I'm paraphrasing again, but she insinuated that the Prime Minister and his office and his staff pressured her to reconsider her decision to intervene in this situation because of the jobs implication in Montreal and political considerations. Now, for those of you who are watching, who are in the energy sector, you're looking at me. I was just asked this in a radio interview earlier about 15 minutes ago from Calgary. Well, why would he go to the wall for a company who stands, it's been reported that they did things like allegedly pay for prostitutes for Muammar Gaddafi's son, for a Libyan dictator's son, and yet you're tabling legislation like Bill C-69, the No More Pipelines bill, and keeping me out of work. This is very divisive. So why should you care about this scandal? Because the Prime Minister is using an argument that he's standing up for jobs in one area of the country based on potentially, and this is what the former Solicitor General said in committee yesterday, allegedly interfering in the process of criminal prosecution. But on the other hand, what's happening in the energy sector, we shouldn't be paying attention to. This is a huge problem. This is the leader of the government, our top public servant, being politically concerned about one area of the country and not the other. And regardless, again, of how you vote, you should we should not be allowing that, or even how you feel about the energy sector, we should not be allowing that type of divisiveness to happen in this country. But his actions, his alleged actions, speak otherwise. The last component before I get into the closing argument here on why you need to care is, this is a man, Justin Trudeau, and many of you have seen this, who has used something for votes to great extent, and that's the concept of feminism. So Justin Trudeau, and regardless of how you feel about him, you know, he's gone out and he said, I'm a feminist. I believe women. And in the last 2 weeks, his pushback to Jody Wilson-Raybould's allegations have been what? She experienced things differently. One of his Liberal MPs today said her dad is pulling her strings and she probably just has sour grapes. Unknown Liberal sources have said things like, oh, she's difficult. And then yesterday in the committee meeting, I watched Liberal MPs that were likely, and I don't know for sure, but they were likely put up by the PMO to essentially gaslight this woman, asking questions that amounted to, or could be summarized as, why didn't you report this sooner? Why didn't you fight hard enough? And you know, I have to say this, I'll say this right now. There's a lot of women who don't report things because of those exact types of non-belief statements. So on one hand, you have the Prime Minister going out saying, we believe women and we support women. And on the other hand, he's essentially engaging in and overseeing smearing of this woman. And again, like, I might not agree with her on policy, but based on her testimony yesterday, what she was trying to do was ensure that there was not an abrogation of democracy. And so you cannot allow Justin Trudeau at this point in time to say, like, essentially, I saw this one tweet that I think summed it up really well. Justin Trudeau, through all of this action, and this is like the cherry on top, he's not a feminist. He uses women instead of supporting them. So why should you care? The bottom line on this, why should you care about this? Why should you follow this? Why should you share this video? Because this is now about a trust issue with the Prime Minister of Canada. I mean, I can make you all sorts of arguments about why Justin Trudeau should not lead this country based on his policy decisions, and I do that all the time. But this is different, and this is significant. And again, if you're a Liberal who's watching this, you now have to ask yourself, can we trust this Prime Minister? If he's gone this far, as he is alleged to have done in this situation, then does he have the moral authority to lead this country? And for me, my party leader, Andrew Scheer, the answer is very clearly and very simply no. He needs to resign. The leader of the public service, Michael Wernick, also needs to resign. And the RCMP now needs to come in and investigate this. You need to understand too that Justin Trudeau has been saying that this is up to the Ethics Commissioner to investigate. I want to be very clear. The Ethics Commissioner does not have the mandate to investigate these types of criminal allegations. There's a reason why Justin Trudeau is saying we want the Ethics Commissioner to investigate, because it's out of their scope. This is why today we called for the RCMP to investigate. So it's very important that you share this video, and it's very important that you talk to other people about this. I know it's a bit of a long watch, but we cannot allow this to happen in our country. From the bottom of my heart, if there's one thing that should unite all of us, it's to protect the independence of our judiciary, make sure that it's free from political influence, make sure that we're not having this divisive conversation about, you know, jobs via this mechanism of intervention, not allowing Trudeau to be a fake feminist. And frankly, I mean, this really is about just completely not understanding what it means to be a public servant. You have to put the needs of the country before your own interests. And what Justin Trudeau stands to allege to have done is the exact opposite of that, while potentially influencing or allegedly being involved in influencing the outcome of a criminal prosecution. It's very serious. You need to care and you need to share. I will be participating in an emergency debate tonight in the House of Commons that we're forcing with regard to this. We will definitely be trying to take more action on this regard, even though Justin Trudeau's, it's kind of convenient timing right now because the House of Commons isn't scheduled to sit for the next 2 weeks. But nonetheless, We will work hard for you, and that is what I'm going to do. I'm going to get across the street and make sure that I'm participating in that debate. Share this video, please. If you've never shared a political video before, it's important that you do this. Working hard for you in Ottawa. Have a great day.